Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the New York City Alliance's webinar on communicating your primary prevention messages to the community. I'm Shashwati from the New York City Alliance, and I'll be the moderator for today's call. Today, we will explore some of the effective strategies for crafting successful sexual violence prevention messages that resonate with our targeted audience, be it your neighborhood community, the school that you're working with, or a group of you that you're trying to reach out to. So welcome everyone once again to the webinar. The New York City Alliance is proud to be designated by the New York State Department of Health as a center of excellence in primary prevention. At the Alliance, we envision a city free from sexual violence. Our hope is to build the capacity of communities, organizations, and institutions to advance the right to live free from sexual violence. And in doing so, the Alliance is actively involved in primary prevention work. So we provide resources, training, and technical assistance to our peer and partner programs. You can actually visit our website at sbfreenyc.org to access our prevention newsletters, blogs, and resources. We also encourage you to sign up for our weekly digest and welcome you to check out our new and improved primary preventions. I do have a few quick tips about our webinar today and how you can participate on this call. Please remember to make sure that your computer is compatible with ReadyTalk, which means you might have to install the conference plugins as you log into ReadyTalk, which I would imagine is pretty safe and easy. If you are already signed in, please remember to dial in the number that you see at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen for audio. You can also mute your lines by pressing *6. Cognizant of your busy workday, we have tried to keep this webinar to an hour, so we do have a very tight agenda for today's call. Our guest speaker, Brad Perry, would use the first 45 minutes to present on this topic and then address all your questions at the end of his presentation. But before we get started, I do want to remind everyone that if you have a comment or insight or question, we would like to hear from you. So please, during the call, you can participate by chatting in your question and comment in the text chat box that you see at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. If you have a question or comment for Brad, please text chat your comment, and I will pass that information on to Brad, and he will then weave that into his conversation. We will also be using screen sharing technology on this call, which means Brad has kindly offered to run the presentation out of his computer for better screen control. Finally, this call is being recorded, so you can also access the webinar recording for playback by visiting our website or reviewing our weekly digest. Okay. So a bit of a background about this webinar. So what happened is this summer, the Alliance, in collaboration with the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault and the New York State Department of Health, spearheaded a statewide technical assistance needs assessment survey. We reached out to about 70 and over rape crisis programs statewide, and then we conducted extensive interviews with coordinators from each of those programs to find out about their everyday struggles, challenges, successes as preventionists. So during that conversation, what happened was many of the program coordinators started talking about how important they thought it was to be effective in the way we craft our primary prevention messages, which is true because we all realize that sexual violence prevention is not always an easy subject to talk about. And then when it comes to communicating our primary prevention messages to the community we are working with, we often wonder what would resonate the most with our audience. So the webinar today is our effort to address some of those questions. By the end of the webinar, we hope to learn from Brad some of the core pieces of communicating our messages, which includes how do we make our prevention messages count? What are some of the steps we need to follow in order to design messages that make sense for our audience? We also want to learn about some of the successful primary prevention media campaigns, as well as find out about creative as well as simple ways of measuring the impact of our primary prevention messages. However, I do want to remind you that this webinar is not a one-time only conversation. We will continue to work with you on expanding your community change efforts. And with that in mind, on January 9th, we are hosting a 3-hour intensive workshop on community mobilization in New York City, where our presenter, Priscilla Gonzalez, will be talking about some of the organizing strategies using a social justice anti-oppression framework, which is really very important and quintessential to our work. So if you're interested in finding out more about this training, please send me an email after this webinar, and I will be happy to provide you with more details. So with that, I would like to introduce you to our guest speaker, Brad Perry. Some of you might recognize Brad from the National Sexual Assault Conference this year. Brad has worked at the Virginia Sexual and Domestic Violence Action Alliance for 11 years as a statewide prevention coordinator. In his role, he started the first male-focused sexual assault peer education group at James Madison University. He also provided training and technical assistance to primary prevention initiatives throughout the state of Virginia. He also consulted for the CDC. He currently sits on the national board of Hollaback and works full-time as a strategist at Create Digital, which is an internet branding agency. So welcome, Brad. It's a pleasure having you here with us today. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Well, we'll get started. Rosie the Riveter is a lesson in successful branding around a big gender issue. In the 1940s, when World War II was going, men were being sent off to training and to war. And that left the work of, we needed a much larger workforce to run factories here in the States, especially creating different equipment for World War II. And there was a huge gender norm issue going on where, that was, women were, of course, then very much thought of as staying at home, taking care of the family, not going to a factory or building a new building or what have you. So the government launched a massive campaign to basically shift people's perceptions around women being capable of doing that kind of work. Not just capable, but good at it, to inspire confidence across the country and make sure that we had good morale in the country during the war. Now what's interesting is that, of course, after World War II, in 1945, men came home. A lot of those jobs were given back to them. And that's a whole larger conversation. But looking at this only as a branding initiative, it's pretty fascinating to think that really no more money or promotion was put into Rosie the Riveter after 1945. And yet, Rosie the Riveter is still recognizable by all generations. I actually ran across a survey a few weeks ago that she's still quite well known in women in their teens currently. And everybody knows what she stands for, that she stands for, in general, that women can do any job a man can do. That is a huge success for a public awareness / branding / communications initiative. And it's amazing that, really no more money was really, or time was really put behind it since 1945, and it still maintains to this day. It was a well-designed, very well thought out campaign to last that long. So that just is a quick anecdote about the power that a really effective branding or communications program can have in especially the domain or the area of gender. That said, communication campaign will not end sexual violence. I am not going to ever argue that. But it definitely can push people to think about the issue or aspect of the issue in a different way. It can drive them to take maybe a realistic action that is, for our purposes, toward a prevention goal. And it can push us closer to our goals when an effective and well thought out communication campaign is put with other types of initiatives like institutional changes, grassroots organizing, you name it. But it can be a very effective component of change. So kind of stepping back for a minute, if we look at sort of what has typically been our field's approach to communication campaigns regarding sexual violence prevention. We definitely spend a lot of time deciding how we want to say stuff. Well, sometimes we do anyway. But we often don't ask ourselves, is anybody going to be interested in this outside of our field, outside of people who already know this issue? And I was certainly guilty of this. You should hopefully recognize that this poster is pretty terrible from a communication standpoint. This was a poster that I had a hand in designing about 11 years ago, or no, geez, longer than that, around 2000, 2001. We had a project at the then Sexual Assault Coalition in Virginia called Men of Vision. And we really tried to cram every possible idea we had into one poor little poster that could not in any way sustain all of that thinking. There is just no way that anybody is going to read all that. There is no way that people even necessarily understand what we mean when we say male violence. I know that in some of the follow-ups we found that people thought we were talking about men beating each other up. So there was just a lot of things wrong with this. And unfortunately, I had to learn that the hard way. We put all this time and energy into this thing. We put it out in the community and across the state. And our people liked it. People who worked at sexual violence and domestic violence programs liked it. But no one outside of that seemed to really be moved. When we did follow-up evaluations, no one really got it. People didn't even really recognize it, to be honest. There was so much clutter on this thing that people just ignored it and walked right by it. So we can't expect to just say what we want to say and have anybody who we're trying to move to action outside of our little movement interested in it. So you may be saying, well, that's not. You shouldn't be beating up that campaign. You shouldn't be so hard on yourself or other people who have similar looking public awareness campaigns. At least they're doing something. Mm-hmm. And I would say that that's not really a bar that we want to set. At least we're doing something is a pretty low bar for the time and effort that needs to be put into a communication campaign. We want to be doing something very specific with a specific set of goals, and we want to be trying to reach that. We don't want to just say, okay, well, we did our best. Now, I totally understand that most folks who work in this movement don't necessarily have the background in communications or in marketing or in branding. So that's kind of why we're here. Oftentimes, this is kind of what we do. We throw spaghetti at a wall. In the advertising world, this is a often used metaphor for if we're having a hard time narrowing down what we want to say or narrowing down who we want to say it to, we just say as much as possible and hope that we cover it and hope that people listen. And that doesn't really work, as I hope that first example I showed makes you realize. And the reason that we think that throwing spaghetti at a wall and hoping it sticks can work is because there is such a thing as too much knowledge and passion when it comes to crafting communication campaigns. We need to make sure we have a process in place where we can check our own assumptions so that we are not succumbing to the temptation to just say everything at everybody. An old maxim in advertising and communications in general is if you try to be everything to everyone, you will say nothing to no one. And it is true and has been proven true time and time again. We have to really hone down who we're talking to and what we want to tell them, and it's going to sometimes sting that we can't get across all of the great ideas that we have to really narrow it down to one or two messages, but we do have to do that because the public does not have our knowledge and passion. So to break this down a little further, there's something called the curse of knowledge that is a pretty well-researched idea in cognitive psychology. And a lot of people have written about this. There's actually a great passage in a very interesting book called Made to Stick. Again, it's called Made to Stick, which I highly recommend reading. Has a lot of overlap with what I'm going to talk about. they do a great breakdown of how the curse of knowledge is a problem when you're trying to get across ideas to people that are new to them. And so what the curse of knowledge is that once we know something, we find it hard to imagine what it was like not to know it. So we've kind of become cursed with our own knowledge. And so it becomes difficult for us to explain it to other people because we can't get back to that place where we really didn't know anything and remember what that was like. A good example of this is that for years when I would go up and visit my now in-laws, when I was dating my wife, we would go up and visit her parents, and they would ask me what I did for a living, and I had to explain it easily 10 or 11 times because they kept thinking I was just a cop because they heard sexual assaults and they heard the word prevention, but they had no idea what that meant, and they certainly didn't know what primary prevention was, and they watch Law and Order, so they figure, oh, he works around this sexual assault issue, he must be a cop. That is an example of my own curse of knowledge not getting across very effectively to my parent or to my in-laws what I was doing for a living. I'm sure we've all experienced that when people ask us what we do, and they kind of don't really know what to make of it. And I think there's somebody, I'm hearing some background noise. If everybody could make sure you're muted, *6, please. The other thing that's kind of the flip side of that is the curse of knowledge is sort of cognitive and logical thought process. The other side of that is the emotional side of it, which is our passion blindness. So it's not just sort of our fluency with this work that might cause us to have trouble communicating what we want to communicate to the outside world. It's also that we all want to feel like people want to learn about this issue as much as we do. And we may not be conscious of that, but that sort of constant temptation to give in to that is always there because it is really hard to take these complex issues and make them digestible for people outside of the work. So there's this assumption that people outside the work will approach this issue with the same assumptions that we have. I'll give you an example. When I was working with an all-male peer education group that was getting set up to go into male institutions in a college. So these were guys who were going to go in and talk to fraternities and all-male sports teams and so on about being an ally, essentially, for sexual assault. I was designing the training curriculum for these guys because it was going to be kind of a tall order that we were asking them to do. And I remember there was a whole day we were doing on sort of examining your own biases around gender and race and sexuality, and I just was like, I know this stuff really well. I'll just kind of wing it that day because I didn't really have time to write everything out and really think hard about how I was going to train these guys. And it was a disaster. When it got to that day, they had so many questions that I was just not prepared for in terms of just these basic assumptions that I had long since forgotten were even something that might ever come up for people. And keep in mind, these are guys who signed up for this. These are guys who wanted to be allies. My own passion for the work kind of made me blind to the fact that they were going to, have these questions and be kind of stuck on certain things. Because while they might have been excited to be there, they hadn't been really in the throes of this work for a long time. And so I had to check that and kind of come back to it and figure out a better way to train them. I'm sure we've probably all experienced this if any of us have done training on the call here. So the lesson of all this stuff is that you just can't wing it. Not to say that anybody here is trying to wing it, but I have definitely been a part of public awareness and public communication campaigns around sexual violence where you start getting bogged down in trying to figure all this stuff out and how to talk to the target audience, and it gets frustrating, and eventually somebody, usually at some point, says, oh, it's good enough, let's just go with what we have. And almost always that happens sooner than it should, and we really have to put the time in. And a good process can help that. So that's what we're going to be talking about. The process, at least my process, is based on roughly kind of an advertising model. Advertisers are very good at getting key concepts across to people of any persuasion pretty much, very pithily and quickly. You only have 30 seconds or 60 seconds for a commercial. You only have 10 seconds to look at a billboard. Advertising, for all of its ills, has some very good lessons it can teach anybody trying to craft a smart, savvy, effective communications campaign. And so the advertising process is roughly this. You start with objective, you go to strategy, you go to creative concept, you make sure you execute it well, and you measure it. So that's what we're going to go through. So a few words about objective. One is keep it focused and keep it real. And what do I mean by that? Well, a good example of that, and full disclosure, I'm on the board of Hollaback, but I would have used this example whether or not I was on their board. Now this is a little different than a communications campaign because this is their objective as an organization. But I think it's a really concrete example, and it guides all of their communication campaigns too. They have narrowed down what could be a very complicated objective as an organization, this was well before I was involved with them, to one powerful little statement. And it's important to do that because you need that one powerful little statement to be your North Star, whether you're building an organization or whether you are building a public awareness campaign. Because you're going to be pulled in so many directions as you're developing it, you need to always be able to come back. So it's really worth spending the time up front to get a very focused, very real, very vivid objective in a nice one-sentence statement. So for instance, Hollaback is use the organizational power of the internet to expose street harassment. So that's very handy for them as an organization when they're getting proposed partnerships all the time with different people and different groups. They can come back to that and say, does this match up with what our stated objective is as an organization? You can do the same thing with a public awareness campaign. Once you've decided, here's what we must accomplish based on research, needs assessment, whatever, assignment from your funder, what have you, here is what our North Star has to be. And so anything else that's going to take away from that, we have to just let it go and keep moving toward this North Star. I know that I've been involved in a lot of things where we want to communicate something as basic as we want, call this hotline number if you've experienced sexual violence, right? That's a pretty set, focused, real communication objective. Now, it might not be prevention in nature, but just for an example, that is, call this number. We want people to know that they can call this number and they'll get help. What often comes up is, well, we have this billboard space. Maybe we can also add in a little message about, and also check out our website, or we have this event coming up as a fundraiser, and we'll put something about that in the advertising materials. And then, oh, hey, there's also this piece right now. You've got to stay focused and kind of practice the art of ruthless exclusion, as one of my mentors once called it. Really stay focused on that objective. Another thing about objectives is it's very helpful if you try to make them interesting. So the example of, people can get help if they call this number, maybe not so interesting. You could spend 10 minutes and make that a little bit more vivid so that you would remember it and so that other people remember it when they're being told off in some other directions. So if we make it interesting, we might get an interesting result. A good example of this is the My Strength is Not for Hurting, or the Men of Strength poster campaign that Men Can Stop Rape has done. So they could have easily started with some objective like, we want to prevent sexual assault by repositioning masculinity as the positive force in men's lives. And, it could be this long paragraph thing that no one remembers to ever stick to. But instead, and I know that this is what they've used, is it's simply this: show that men's strength doesn't have to mean domination. So the poster campaign that results from that statement, from that objective, is very focused. It comes through. It's much more memorable than something that's a lot more sort of abstract and vague, such as repositioning masculinity as a positive. That's all great, but it helps to put a sharper point on it so that you get a sharper result. Moving on to strategy, because one of these should flow from the other. So you have a good objective, it's going to lead you to having a better strategy. When I say strategy, I mean, okay, you know what you're setting out to do once you have your objective. Now, how are you going to do that? So, for instance, and this isn't to be confused with tactics. This isn't, are we going to do a billboard, or are we going to do a TV spot, or are we going to do a radio spot? Those are all tactical elements. What I mean is, how are we going to talk about the issue, some corner of sexual violence prevention that we're focusing on, in a way that is going to resonate with our intended audience? How are we going to frame it is one way to think about strategy. So you want to be targeted, and that means if you, again, you got to make sure that you're really speaking to your focused group of people. That means you have to identify who are the most important groups of people to talk to. I would recommend narrowing it down to one group of people. And it helps to use not just demographics, but psychographics, motivational research if you can get it. So if you're doing a program in a school, for example, it might help to do a survey of the student body to figure out, what are their attitudes about sexual violence? What are their attitudes about being a bystander, for example? And when you process that data, you look at their answers, you might see that there is a group that's kind of on the fence that could be very influential in tipping the school one way or the other. That they want to stand up and say stuff, and they identify problem behaviors, but they just need that extra oomph to get them to actually do it. That might be your target audience. And you would get that from doing some, I would call it consumer research, but key stakeholder research, for example. And that's what Driven by Insights is about. If you have good, if you kind of poke around a little with your target audiences, if you narrow it down to a school, or you narrow it down to, people this age to this age living in this city, that's a good first step. But if you actually go in and talk to people about the issue before you really start creating any materials, you can really get some great insights as to how you can frame the issue, and you can identify who the people are that are the most likely to be helpful to your cause. So garbage in, garbage out is just kind of a quick way to say, if you're not doing any of that up front, or if all you can do is narrow it down by people this age to this age living in this city, that's probably not going to be very helpful. You're going to be pretty much guessing as to what their thoughts are, and so then your strategy is not going to really be able to be based on anything that's kind of real and might actually move them to action. Now, I realize everybody has limited budgets. I'm not talking about doing a peer-reviewed study. I'm talking about literally going out and just talking, finding these folks, identifying them to the best of your ability, and talking to even 10 of them can be tremendously helpful, because you'll start to see patterns. I know it's not scientific, but it will help, I promise. So one example of this was a project that I worked on some years ago, and these won't all be things that I worked on. This one just happens to be one I'm familiar with. This was for Virginia's take on the Stop It Now organization. We really wanted to, we identified, we did a needs assessment of the state around child sexual abuse, and we identified that there were a group of people who had known that abuse was going on. They suspected it. They felt it kind of intuitively, but they couldn't prove anything was happening. And then once it came out that there was sexual abuse going on in their home, or their neighbor's home, or somewhere with which they were involved, they said, I knew that was happening. I wish I had a place to go, because maybe I could have processed this and said something, and it would have stopped it sooner. When we found that out, we knew how we wanted to focus our Stop It Now campaign. And we made the whole thing about these folks who see it happening, have that twinge, but don't quite know how to put it to words, or don't know where to go with that information. And so we excluded every other possible target audience and only focused the materials on that group. And so that's why you get this image of a adult's hand holding a child's hand. It says, it doesn't feel right when I see them together. Most people don't know, they don't know what that means. They just would kind of bypass that billboard or that bus ad and wouldn't think twice about it. But for the people who are dealing with that, who are having actively that thought, They know exactly what it means when they see that with child sexual abuse underneath of it, and they know where they can go. And what we found in our post-assessment was 87% of the people who visited the website or called the number were exactly those people who we were trying to target. So it was tremendously successful in moving them to take the action we wanted them to take, which was to basically call this helpline and process through what they could do next, and get help to the kids who needed it and the families who needed it. Another component of strategy is to be single-minded. And this is kind of, you're going to hear me say this in a lot of different ways, but again, practice that art of ruthless exclusion. Really focus, once you get those insights from talking to, once you narrow down that target audience and get those insights as to what might move them, start to really figure out that one angle that you can take that is going to be the best one. And you can go back to those people in your target audience, the same people you talked to before, or other people who kind of are of the same background and makeup, and you can ask them, hey, what do you think of this? Or what do you think of this? Red Flag Campaign did exactly that. We would come up with some rough messaging once we realized the Red Flag Campaign itself was our way to go about this, and we realized that bystanders really just need to be shown some concrete examples of what they're witnessing is a problem, and then a concrete prompt of what they could say or do about it. We wanted to test out a lot of different ways of executing that strategy, and so we would constantly take these different iterations of messaging back to the types of college kids that we were trying to reach with this program, and see if it worked. And so that's kind of how the ones that we ended up using rose to the top. The actual text you see there, the design, everything. That gets into tactics too. It gets into testing your tactics. But at a strategy level, we needed to make sure that we were talking about bystander behavior around dating violence in a way that resonated with the target audience. And so it's okay to kind of test it out a little bit. Another point about strategy is finding an interesting point of view. So you're looking for the opportunities, and you're trying to make people think about sexual violence prevention in a way they never have before. And that can be tricky. But it's basically, one good basic rule is to kind of stay away from the low-hanging fruit, I would call it. So stay away from throwing a bunch of stats at people. Stay away from fear tactics. There's all the basic things that you can avoid that are kind of the tropes of public awareness and public communication campaigns in our work. There's a campaign that has been going on right now called Don't Be That Guy, and I'm pretty sure that there probably wasn't a lot of testing done on that with their intended audience, because I've worked on some campaigns that had very similar messaging, and over again what you find is that when there's a kind of a sort of catchphrase type thing like that in there that has a lot of different meanings, because Don't Be That Guy, of course, is something that kind of, bro college guys say to each other, like when they're trying to sort of police one another's behavior. Don't be that guy could easily get misinterpreted as don't be that guy that catches a rape charge, not because you think that your friend did anything wrong, but because that girl is lying or whatever. And there was a whole counter campaign to this that they kind of hijacked Don't Be That Guy and had this Don't Be That Girl campaign, which is a whole other issue. But if whoever was behind that, I think it spent just a little more time, and I apologize if I'm not trying to bash whoever did this, but just to give you a concrete example, Don't Be That Guy is not a particularly original point of view, right? It's kind of the same thing we say over and over again to men. There's an assumption that the guy is guilty. Well, that right there is going to kind of get people to shut you down. There's a don't, which is you don't really want to lead with the negative ever, right? So there's a couple of strikes against framing, being a bystander, being an ally, man to man, in that way, that are just red flags right off the bat. So there was probably a more interesting way to frame a similar message, but it takes time up front to figure out what that would be. One interesting angle on sexual violence prevention that happened just in the last few years, or it's become popular in the last few years, is to take the litany of things that campus police especially, or really all kinds of different folks, like to tell women all the time of, don't do this, don't do that, don't walk, check your car, all the stranger danger tips for sexual assault. And it's not that those tips aren't helpful in general to keep people safe when you're in a city or wherever, but those are certainly seen by a lot of women as very disempowering, and the onus, of course, is put on the potential victim, or especially women in this case, to keep themselves safe from sexual assault. And so some very smart people just kind of naturally came up with the sort of flip side of that list, which was how to really prevent sexual assault every time. And they turned all of them on their head. So don't put drugs into other people's drinks in order to control their behavior. If you're in an elevator with someone and someone else gets in, don't assault them, right? So they kind of turned all those tips on their head and made people think about prevention, in this case, in a totally different way. Why isn't the onus on the perpetrator? The reason this list is funny is because it's kind of breaking the way our brains think about it in a really interesting way. So that's strategy. Creative concepts. Now, once you have your framing, or the kind of angle that you're going to take, it's going to be an interesting point of view. It's going to be single-minded. It's going to be based on insights from your research with your audience. Even, again, just kind of cursory research is good. Just spend some time talking to the folks you're trying to reach. Once you have all that and you've narrowed it all down to a nice, strategy statement, it's time to start thinking about how you would bring that to life. So this, and I would say that maybe doing creative concepting is maybe one of the trickiest things for folks in our field, mostly because it's not typically the skill set that folks have. We're not hiring folks who do this. It's not to say there aren't creative people in our work. I don't mean that at all. I just mean the folks that sort of come out of a discipline of doing creative concepting. So one of the things you'll see me say is maybe find some folks who do that full time, but I want to also just give everybody on the webinar a little bit of background on, so they can maybe all of you can kind of start practicing a little bit and looking at how to bring ideas to life in a way that will actually cut through and be memorable. So the first rule of a good creative concept when you're creating a really memorable creative concept is to dramatize. I think we have trouble with that sometimes because we come from more of this academic and or activist background where we like to put lots of caveats on things, and we're very sort of matter of fact, and we're very.
Obviously, you've seen this page before because you've taken its pictures.
Hello? Is somebody on? Sorry, heard something there. Anyway, when you're dramatizing, it can be tricky because we're kind of used to talking to each other very straightforward, I think, in this work. So to give ourselves a little permission to bring some stuff to life and to show rather than telling goes against, people who are great grant writers might have a lot of trouble with this, right? Because it's a whole different way of expressing yourself. And we need great grant writers, so that's not slang on anybody. And good stories count totally as showing and not telling. So I will just describe this video because we couldn't get the link to work, but there's a really great demonstration of how to dramatize something, and I'll just take you through this verbally. There's this great video on YouTube. If you type in, well, I'll tell you what to type in a second, but there's this blind man, and he is asking for spare change on like a town square or city square, and he has a sign that says, "I'm blind, please help." And a woman walks by, and she has these very like specific sounding shoes. So it's like this sound signature that this blind man can pick up on. And she walks up, and his ears kind of perk up, and she picks up his sign, and she turns it over, and she writes something different on it, and she puts it back down and walks away. And all of a sudden, his can starts filling up with money. People start donating like crazy, like they never had before. And the next day, he hears the woman walking by again, and he stops her and he says, "What did you change on my sign?" And she says, "All I did was say the same thing you said, but I said it in a different way." And they show the sign, and instead of "I'm blind, please help," it said, "It's a beautiful day outside and I can't see it." So you can see there, it's a more dramatized expression of "I'm blind, please help." It's a beautiful day outside and I can't see it. It's just saying the same thing in a way that captivates people more readily. So I hope that makes sense in terms of what I mean by trying to spend time coming up with a really good dramatic creative concept. An example of this in our work is this wonderful, I think, wonderful campaign from the Home Office in the UK, and it's called "If You Could See Yourself." And it's a really brilliant way to bring to life sort of getting them to think about hookup culture and how they participate in hookup culture in a way that doesn't really feel like it's assuming they're the bad guy, because it's posing the question more as an intellectual, like as a question of curiosity. Would you see rape? Would you even know how you were behaving? Could you even take yourself out of your own skin and look at your behavior objectively? And I encourage everybody to go check it out. But basically, kind of all the different video vignettes have different sort of aspects of hookup culture, and at some point when a guy crosses the line, he finds himself, sort of his better self is trapped on the other side of a glass wall, and he's trying to tell the poorly behaving version of himself to stop crossing the line with the man or woman that they're with. And it's a really smart way to bring it to life. I'm not doing it justice, but it's a way that I've never seen this kind of message communicated before. Another aspect of taking seriously creative concepts is to take it seriously. Even if you're being funny, it really helps to spend a lot of time and be disciplined about not stopping at the first idea or even the first few ideas. And there's a few techniques for this, and there's a little bit of background on this. That thing on the left there is what's called a mind map, and it's how you can oftentimes quickly get to a deeper idea. So what you do is you kind of start with, okay, we want to get men to be better allies when they see problem behavior, for example. How would we say that? And so then you maybe start with 4 or 5 different ways to say that, and you come up with 4 or 5 different ways to say each of them, and you start just associating deeper and deeper, out and out and out, until you have something that at some point you're going to strike some gold, and you're going to say, ooh, that's a really interesting way to say that I never would have thought, and you can kind of bring it back. But it takes some time, and it takes some discipline. There's certainly books to good creative concepting. Hey, Whipple Squeeze This. The first few chapters of that are really good as far as getting at the creative process of communication campaigns. The rest of it, you don't need as much, but the first few chapters are quite helpful. And there's trainings by groups like the Yes Men, who are these really smart kind of cultural revolutionary guys, and they train people how to come up with culture jams, is what they call them. Force, who did the hijacking of the Victoria's Secret fashion show under the Pink Got Consent, I'm going to show you guys that in a minute. They are heavily influenced by these trainings and have attended these trainings. Force is a group in Baltimore that does dismantling rape culture work. Another aspect of the creative concept, and I alluded to this earlier, is that it might be a good idea to partner with creative professionals or organizations. If you live in a town with a university or college, you almost always can find some type of group on campus that is doing some type of activism or art project or what have you that might be good just to have them in the mix on your planning committee, because they'll come up with ideas that are kind of out there that, oftentimes in a good way, that can get you thinking in some different directions. Force in Baltimore is one of my favorites anywhere in the country, and they've partnered with some different coalitions to do some work. But before they partnered with anybody, they kind of made their name by last year by creating a hoax Victoria's Secret site that made it seem like Victoria's Secret was suddenly embracing the idea of consent and different body images. And they actually tricked a bunch of the Victoria's Secret campus street team people. In other words, these like local reps at colleges who sort of shill for Victoria's Secret on that campus. They tricked them into retweeting because they were so convincing at this email and at the fake Twitter account they made that all of these different Victoria's Secret marketing people thought it was really coming from the home office of Victoria's Secret and tweeted it back out, and it just caught on. They even managed to be one of the top trending hashtags during Victoria's Secret's fashion show, diverting a lot of traffic from the fashion show to this consent site. And then people were very peeved to learn that, of course, Victoria's Secret came out and said, no, we had nothing to do with it. We're not about consent. Then people wanted to know, well, why? That's, we were really into this idea. So it kind of proved a nice point. This is just kind of a rundown of kind of how to think about creative concepting. Don't stop until you've really gotten something that you can take to somebody who has no idea about our work, and you can give them the gist of what you're planning to do, and they go, ooh, that's cool, I get that. It's not enough just to kind of pass it around the office, because again, curse of knowledge, passion blindness. So keep working on it until you can talk to someone who is uninitiated in this work, and they get it, and they don't just get it, but they're interested by it. Good example of this on a related issue to ours is the It Gets Better project. Seems very simple, but I know that it had a long history with Dan Savage. It started on his radio show, podcast, and column, and he kept developing it over the course of a year until it became this massive phenomenon and really caught on like wildfire, and has made a huge difference in bringing awareness to and arguably preventing bullying of LGBTQ youth. A few words about execution. So it's great to have a good creative concept, but you want to make sure that what you're producing, your tactics, so your poster, your event, your billboard, your radio spot, your TV spot, whatever, it's good to make sure that you're putting all the thinking in detail into actually what you're producing as well. And that includes placement. So making sure that you're reaching people where they are. Now, if you're in a school or something, that's kind of a captive audience. That's a little bit of a no-brainer. But you can even think about where in the school do people have the most time to read or take in something. So maybe over the urinals is like an unconventional place. Because, for example, if you're trying to reach guys, they're kind of stuck there for a few minutes. Or maybe in the areas that people are hanging out in between classes instead of just anywhere in the hall. So even little things like that are good to think about. And how can you make your messages easier to share? That's particularly important in social media. Making sure that you have, the share widgets on everything. If you have something on like a website, making sure that people can share it out easy. Making sure that you've kind of optimized all your links. Anybody who's done any work in social kind of will know what I'm talking about there. If that's kind of something that you're not really familiar with, I would recommend trying to either get an intern or just getting somebody's kid to come in and help make sure that if you're doing something online that it's as shareable as it possibly could be. Because kids definitely know when they see something that's going to be quick to pick up on. A good example of this was Planned Parenthood of the Great Northwest up in Oregon and Washington State did a really brilliant campaign where they wanted to normalize condom use amongst teenagers, and they realized that with the particular population of teenagers they were going after, Foursquare was a big thing. This was a few years ago. And so they let people check in to their condom use, and it was a novel enough and an interesting enough of an idea and was executed well because it was mobily optimized for smartphones. It was very clean messaging. It was a very easy idea that it caught on. And so you actually saw how many other people were using condoms in your area, and it made it not such a weird thing. It normalized the behavior. And that was really smart because they realized that okay, we have a massive geographical area that we have to reach, but all these kids are on smartphones and they're all using Foursquare. So that's what we need to sort of, that's in terms of placement, that's how we have to think. So there's an example of catching them where they're talking online, virtually, not in a physical location. And just once again, kind of a different way of saying it, definitely sweat the details. And a good example of this, I'm going to use Force one more time. They're doing this project called the Memorial Project in Washington, D.C., where they want to create temporary and then ultimately a permanent set of memorials to sexual assault survivors. This is based on something Judith Herman said in her book, where she said, we have memorials to all kinds of other trauma from war and trauma from these horrific historical events. We should have, one of the most constant traumas in our culture is sexual violence. We should have a monument or a memorial that people can grieve and is a flashpoint for sexual violence. And so they're trying to actually pressure officials to create this. And one of the things they did was just to start setting these up temporarily in areas where there are already national memorials. And it took a lot of planning to do this. First they had to figure out what the messaging would be. They had to then make the letters. They had to lay them out on a football field, take a photo because they needed to make sure they could get in and get out quickly because of course this wasn't approved. Make sure they could load them up, take them over to the reflecting pool, the National Mall, have enough people to set them out, and then bam, you have something that has been shared thousands of times on social media and is starting to have their idea catch on. So it took a lot of planning. A couple of quick words about measurement. There's process measurement, of course. So who did you distribute it to and how many people? If you're online, how many impressions did you get? Usually this stuff gets generated by Facebook or wherever automatically on your analytics tab. Awareness and recall, that's where you would go back into either the school or if you're online, do a survey of your target audience and get them to ask them, did you see anything about this topic? If so, what was it? And if they recall it, then you did well. Outcome measures, of course, are a little trickier, but clicks and conversions. So if you're trying to drive to a specific action, say online, then how many people actually followed your what you put out there and followed it through to the landing page or whatever you were trying to get them to. Attitude assessments, this can be done in physical world or online. And environmental observation, this is especially in schools. Are there independent observers who can say, this is the environment of the school has changed as a result of this intervention. So I just want to close by saying this. There are people who have said that branding and advertising can't offer us anything as far as preventing sexual violence because branding and advertising is all about driving commerce, and that's an activity that we're well acquainted with, and it's a set of behaviors that we already do, and preventing sexual violence is a whole new set of behaviors, and we can't possibly do anything with communication campaigns. And I would argue that that is completely false. It is not a new behavior. It's all in how we frame it. And I would frame preventing sexual violence as a set of behaviors that are the extension of the best parts of our humanity. So let's figure out how to tell that story and how to share it with the world. And I'll take any questions we have time for.
Thank you so much, Brad. That was wonderful, and thanks for walking us through the process. This is Shashati, and we do have a couple of questions from our participant. I have one question that's related to what you were just talking about in terms of outcome and measurement.
Mm-hmm.
So the participant is wondering about how did you measure campaigns like It Gets Better, where you are measuring attitude and behavioral changes?
Yeah, and I wasn't involved in that campaign, so I don't know how they measured it. In terms of process, all you have to do is go look at their site and see the hundreds of thousands, well at this point millions, of independent views. So, to know how many people it has certainly been digested by. As far as its impact, you can look at a number of, this again, outcome is tricky because oftentimes it's all we can figure out is anecdotal, but some funders understand the importance of that and some don't. I would argue that anecdotal evidence can be very helpful in starting to figure out outcome evaluations. So for example, there were a bunch of news reports after It Gets Better for just to use that as an example, after that kind of blew up and became really popular, there were a number of news reports citing that program as why a school adopted an ordinance or a set of rules in their school against LGBTQ bullying. I think that's a pretty concrete measurement of the effectiveness of that campaign. I know that we often get held to a standard of, well, you have to show that you're moving attitudes. So, if you're working in a school or you're working with a set of people online, you just have to make sure that you're building in up front the ability to ask them up front sort of different attitudinal assessment around whatever it is you're trying to measure, whether it be attitudes about rape, attitudes about bystander behavior, and their likeliness of doing that, of stepping in when they see something, for example. And there's various instruments out there that you can use.
Back in just a moment.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
Brad, I can hear you though.
Okay. I don't know what happened there. Anyway, you just got to make sure that you build in being able to talk to them up front with some sort of survey usually, or you could do focus groups if you want to do qualitative. And then make sure that you can reach either those same people or very similar people from that same target audience after you've put your activation into the field to see what kind of an impact it had. The problem you're going to run into is that oftentimes the survey instruments are not sensitive enough or maybe not asking quite the right questions, but you just find the best one you can use and go with that. I would try to get your funder, whoever's funding the project, to understand the importance of things like environmental observation rather than a survey tool. And then you would just need to train sort of independent observers, and there's all sorts of things online you can get for free that talk about training observers for school bullying and all sorts of other stuff. I know that I think Nan Stein has written at length about that as an assessment measure for school bullying, and it would be very easy to adapt that. Somebody may have already done this, but adapting that methodology for our kind of work if we're doing it in a school or any place where you have the target audience kind of congregating.
Perfect. Thank you, Brad. Thank you so much. And we have one quick last question.
Sure.
Is when you have many of our programs are struggling with funding restrictions and resources, and we have fewer staff members. With that resources, when you are out in the community trying to float your message or trying to float your campaign, how, in addition to what you suggested, how might a program determine its targeted audience? Like, what are some of the other ways, if you have quick tips on that?
Yeah, I mean, I really feel you on the funder thing, because I certainly experienced that when I was at the Virginia Coalition. And all I can say is, and we had varying degrees of success with this, and it's going to depend on your funder, but if your funder is cutting funds and still expects you to deliver a public awareness campaign that has all these different components and evaluation, and you're trying your best to go through a proper process such as this, or not proper, but a process that's going to be helpful to your final product such as this, then I would say that there needs to be some consideration for, not doing so much formal stuff up front. You can do a lot of really good targeting based on just going out and talking with people. So going out, for instance, you know that you need to do something in a school, or you need to do something with a given swath of kids in your community. Find out where they hang out. Find out if you can actually go talk to them. If you don't feel comfortable talking to them, maybe train an intern who's younger and might speak their language more to go talk to them. And just start trying to get inside their heads a little bit, and even if it's really informally and one by one. Again, if you talk to 10 kids in a kind of a target audience or a swath of people that you want to talk to, you'll start to get some ideas about, oh, well, maybe we should kind of focus it this way. And that's better than nothing. It really, really is better than nothing. It might feel like it's unscientific and it's not, it doesn't have the rigor and it's not validated, but again, if we don't have the funding to go through a big formal process, then I don't think you can be expected to. So it's better to go and just have some conversations with your intended target audience, or even trying to figure out who your intended target audience is, just to go have those discussions with those kids or with those people before you do anything. And I guarantee it will open your eyes and get you thinking in a way that you wouldn't have otherwise, even if you talk to 10 people.
Thank you so very much, Brad. That was really helpful because we are working within our community in different capacity, whether we are doing prevention education in school or out there in the community. We have some access oftentimes, and I think that was a really great suggestion on reaching out to them, and that also in a way suggests that you engage the community in what you are creating. So thank you for that.
And also make sure that you're letting them make sure that they know they're safe enough that they can talk totally honestly. So you really have to avoid passing judgment on anything they say, because you want to hear the unvarnished take on whatever issue it is you're asking them about. So little caveat there.
Oh, yeah, that was really helpful because, we do have to be mindful that they know that it's safe and their information is also confidential and it'll stay with you as a person trying to find out more about the community. With that, I really want to thank all of the participants. And Brad, thank you so very much for being on this call. And this was really very helpful for all of us doing this work and every day wanting to figure out how better we could improve our work, reach out to the community. So all of those suggestions and feedbacks were really wonderful and helpful. And really I feel that it could be used in our everyday work. So it's not out in the space. It's really something that we could do from our home offices or our desk. And thank you, Brad, for your wonderful, wonderful presentation. You all have a great day. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.